Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Seed Gathering Masterclass. We're delighted that so many of you can join us for this fascinating topic of growing trees from seeds. My name is Katie Rafferty and I'm part of the brilliant National Schools Programme team here at the Tree Council. And joining me today is my colleague John Stokes, who I will introduce properly in just a few minutes. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the Tree Council, but then we're going to explore the incredible diversity of tree seeds and learn how to collect and process seeds to grow your very own free trees. We'll do our best to answer your questions, so if you have any, please do use the Q&A function. You can hopefully see a button at the bottom of your screen to ask us a question. For those of you who are new to the Tree Council, we are a national charity who bring everyone together for the love of trees. We fund, plant and care for trees, orchards and hedgerows with the help of amazing volunteers and through our community grant scheme. In fact, I'd just like to say a big warm welcome to any of our volunteer tree wardens who have joined us today. Thank you so much for everything that you do up and down the UK. We also work to inspire the next generation of young environmentalists through our National Schools Programme. And I'd just like to add at this point that we are currently open for applications for our Young Tree Champions programme. So if any of you have got any connections to schools who you think might want to get involved, we will share the link in the chat. We also harness the power of partnership working with the charity's 100 or so membership organisations to help create a healthy tree-filled future for our planet. And we use practical science and research to influence policy and support best practice on trees and the environment. The Tree Council encourages community action through seasonally focused campaigns. Autumn equinox marks the start of the seed gathering season. It's a month-long celebration every autumn to inspire communities and families to gather seeds, fruits and nuts from their local trees and to sow, nurture and grow the trees of the future. Hopefully you will all have enjoyed the webinars that we've already held as part of our seed gathering season this year. If not, please do check out our website. You can see 2 fantastic webinars, including last week's fascinating Seeds Time Capsules of Life with Rob Kessler and Dr. Wolfgang Stuppy. So please do take a look. We then, at the end of November every year, celebrate National Tree Week, and each year upwards of 250,000 people don their boots and their gloves and come together to celebrate, plant trees and kick off the winter tree planting season. Once trees are in the ground, they need our help to establish, and that's when our Trees Love Care campaign kicks in, and it runs from March to September every year, reminding people, once the rush of the planting season's over, that we need to continue to look after and care for those young trees, and the mature ones too, to make sure that the maximum number survive and reach maturity. Spring in Your Step is a great one to encourage people to shake off the winter and get outside to celebrate spring in local parks, in their streets and in their communities. And of course there is National Hedgerow Week, which takes place in May and celebrates the wonder of hedgerows, the unsung heroes of urban and rural landscapes. So today, for this masterclass as part of seed gathering season, I am delighted to welcome my colleague John Stokes from the Tree Council, who is our Director of Trees, Science and Research and the co-author of the Good Seed Guide, which recently was updated and republished with other expert partners as the Tree Growers Guide. We'll give you a little bit more information on the Tree Growers Guide in a few moments' time, but John, do you want to say hi?
Hello, Katie. How are you this afternoon? Hello,
Yeah,
everybody.
good, thank you. Excited to be here and to have so many people joining us for this masterclass.
I'm just hoping the rain holds off. For those of you that may have joined us on previous years, I'm outdoors, and there have been previous occasions when it hasn't entirely been clement the entire workshop. I am hoping that
be a lesson for those heading out to the gathering as well. So for this masterclass, we're going to go into a little bit more detail about the practice of growing trees from seed. But first things first, John, why would we even bother growing trees from seed? Why do we want to get involved in seed gathering and growing?
So there are lots and lots of reasons for doing that, Katie. But actually, I think before we start, I'm going to throw that question right back at you before we start. So you're an ex-deputy headmistress, I think, from a school that came to join us a few years ago. So why would you collect seed in a school, for example? Why might it be a good thing to do?
Well, for a start, I love seed gathering season, and it's one of my favourite ways of engaging young people in trees, in nature, and in getting involved in growing. But really, for me, it's just an exciting time to take something that may seem small and may seem insignificant, but actually has so much power and potential within it. And it's an exciting journey to go on the exciting hunt, to gather, fun way of getting outside, which is great for health and well-being, but then to nurture something that grows into something, like I said, extremely powerful and important for us in our society and for our planet as a whole. So there are so many messages that can link to seed gathering and the power it creates. So for me, that is why I love engaging young people and people in our communities in seed gathering.
Nicely put. And that is ultimately the truth of it. You see, that is just a seed at the moment, but that could be a 1,000-year-old oak tree if we look after it properly, give it the head start, and let it go for 1,000 years. So in that little tiny thing lies something that could easily become the next generation of important trees. And at the moment, there is literally tons of seed out there waiting to be collected and harvested. And about 95, I'm not exactly sure what the specific number is, but a vast percentage of the seeds that are produced by trees, it's a numbers game. They produce millions of them with the hope and aspiration that they get one or two to survive in their lifetime. You know, if you're an oak tree and you're lasting 1,000 years, you will produce millions of seeds. As an oak tree, you only literally need one to replace you. So there are lots of seeds that are produced. They're used by animals. They're eaten by all sorts of things. Our job is to give them a little bit of an extra helping hand, to get them started, to give them that chance of getting away before they're eaten by a squirrel, before they rot on the ground. So in that sense, that's why it's important to just give nature a little bit of a helping hand and get things started.
Fabulous. So before we think about collecting seed, it would be really interesting for us to get a little bit more information on how trees form seed in the first place, where they come from. And I can see we're starting with an interesting word on the screen there, John, with monoecious.
Monoecious. Monoecious and dioecious, we'll come back to those in a minute. They are a bit technical, but they basically describe where the flowers sit on a tree. So a monoecious tree is a tree that has both sexes of flowers on one tree. So what we're looking at there is a hazel catkin. The catkin is the obvious bit. That's the male part of the flower. What's not quite so obvious is that little tiny circle at the top. That's the female flower. And so what happens is the tree has both male and female flowers on them. Usually they come out at slightly different times so that the pollen of the male flower doesn't just land on the female flower and fertilize the tree itself, because they want to outcross, they want to take pollen from somewhere else. So there's usually a slight difference in the timing of the flowers. And it might seem a long way off to spring, but the hazel is already starting to develop at the moment. And over the next few weeks, hazel flowers will already start to come out. So that's what a monoecious tree is, a tree with both sexes on one tree.
And that pollination, John, that occurs through wind?
So yeah, it's wind pollinated. So the wind blows the catkins, blows the pollen around. It travels for large distances potentially. The statistical odds of a single pollen hitting a single flower are actually pretty small if it's looking at a different tree. So the way you deal with that is you produce a vast quantity of pollen, and that vast quantity of pollen then spreads across the countryside and hopefully finds a female flower on a different tree. That's why things like birches can cause people some problems with hay fever, because they produce large quantities of pollen, because that's what they're doing. The other sort of monoecious trees are where they have both sexes of the tree contained within one flower, and these are the sorts of things that you really think of as a flower. Things like plums, cherries, apples. They have obvious petals, which are designed to attract an insect, because these are insect pollinated. And here the male and female parts, the anther and stigma, are marked, and they're contained within the one flower, so that it's all there in one package. Again, the aspiration is that the pollen from the from the male parts, the anther doesn't land on the stigma, so they come out just slightly differently. And the idea is that there is then a bee or something to transfer the pollen between the two. John Holmes asked a question: if they come out at different times, how does that work? Well, that's because different trees, the female and male flowers come out at different times. So every tree is slightly different. So in a big enough population of trees, what you would have is the male on one comes out maybe a week before the female on itself, but there will be another one where the female's already come out. So the idea is that in a big enough population of trees, that capacity for distribution will work. And you hope that somebody else is producing their male flowers when your females are ripe or are ripening.
Fabulous. Okay, so we'll move on to dioecious trees.
So dioecious trees are where you have two sexes, but they're on different individuals. So holly is a classic example. Holly has male trees and female trees. And the reason everybody, lots of people say, why hasn't my holly produced any berries? Well, odds are it's a male tree. It physically can't do it. So willows are another classic case in point where there's male and female trees, and you need one of each to be able to produce. And then you get really complicated ones, and ash is the most complicated because ash trees are generally male or female, but sometimes a male one can become female, and sometimes a female one can become male, and sometimes a female one can produce a branch that is male, and nobody really understands how on earth that works. So there is some really complicated stuff going on in the gender of an ash tree in terms of its flowers, and that literally can happen year on year. It can change sex within a year.
Fabulous. Now, you talk about complicated stuff going on. We've talked about seeds having magnificent potential within them, but can you give us a little bit more information, John, about exactly what a seed does contain and what the biology is in that seed?
So a seed contains a number of things. It contains the little dormant embryo, which is waiting to pop out and grow. It contains some a sort of protective shell, and on this acorn, the protective shell is obviously the bit the brown that we're all used to looking at. It contains a store of seed, a store of food, because in the first first hours and days after it starts to grow, it needs to have a bit of food, so it stores a bit of food, and it produces things called cotyledons, which are tucked into the seed, and these are called seed leaves. And a seed leaf is, and we can see on the picture in the screen, that's a little beech tree. The seed leaves are tucked within the seed, and it's not true of all seeds, but many seeds. As they come up, they produce these little seed leaves, which then give the plant enough life to get started before its proper leaves start to develop after a few weeks.
Fabulous. And just before we move on to the next bit, Jeremy has asked, is there any point in growing ash saplings or growing ash from seed with dieback and the issues that we have with that?
So, Jeremy, that's a really, really good question. What seems to be happening in some parts of the country is that ash dieback has started to take out lots of trees, but there are a few left. And the few that are left are starting to produce seedlings. And we were at an event in Norfolk a few weeks ago where a professor of seed biology up there is getting quite excited because there's a wood in his part of the world where the ash dieback has been through. It's killed off large percentages of the trees. That a few that are left are starting to breed. And in this particular wood, apparently there were thousands of really healthy looking young ash seedlings coming up. And his suggestion was that what we need to do is to find those healthy trees, collect the seed off those trees from all over the place in your patch, gather that seed up, put it into a seed nursery so that they get started, let them come through, and those trees that survive another batch of ash dieback, the seedlings from them will be really quite resistant to ash dieback. So actually the future of ash and ash seed is really interesting at the moment. And yes, there really is a point in collecting seed from healthy looking trees, because there are now good chances that some of that will have some inbuilt resistance. And we can talk further about that, people, if we want to.
Thanks, John. Okay, so now we know where seeds come from. We're getting ready to go out and gather seed. Is there anything else that we need to think about before we head out and gather seed? Is there any planning that we need to do in terms of what we're collecting, what we're gathering?
Yes, there is. Technically, you can't just go collecting seed off anybody's land anywhere, because it's in that grey area of it. It's not quite legal, but it's not quite illegal. It's just not good practice to go and collect seed from somebody's land that you haven't asked permission from. But as long as one isn't harvesting huge quantities from anybody else's land, the odd seed may not be noticed. But you need to then work out how to get it home. So take a paper bag with you, or a Hessian bag, because they don't like going in plastic bags. So take some sort of collection vessel, collect quantities of seed with the landowner's permission, and just don't do anything dangerous like climbing up to the tops of trees to try and pick the one seed that's on the top branch. It's just not worth it. There will always be another one somewhere nearby. So basic health and safety rules apply. But just generally make sure you're safe, make sure you collect it legally, and make sure you get it home in a safe fashion by having some sort of bag or carrier to bring it home in.
And John, I had a school group that arrived at one of my sessions with pockets full of horse chestnut seeds that they had been delighted to collect from a park on the way. Is there anything that they need to consider in terms of the actual species that they are collecting seeds from, and the onward planning that might need to be done before the gathering starts?
Yeah, different seeds have different processing things, and we're going to do that in a second. But I mean, the first thing obviously is you shouldn't collect all the seed to take home, because you should leave some for the wildlife in the area. So you've got to think about doing a small proportion of useful trees that will be valued to your community. And the art of it is to think, is that a tree that I want to? I mean, there's millions of seeds that you can collect, but is that the seed of something that you'd actually want to grow? Why are you collecting the seed? Why do you want it growing? And that idea of the right tree for the right place is really important. You've got to pick the seed of something that you want to grow. The thing is that, particularly with kids, the obvious one that they can all find and they can all collect is the conker. The conker is the simplest thing to collect. It's also really easy to get to germinate, and it grows really well, which is fantastic. I mean, globally, horse chestnuts are really quite threatened. They're on the international list of threatened species. So as a global thing, horse chestnuts are really important. But would you necessarily want to have your entire village community filled with thousands and thousands of horse chestnuts? Because they will grow, and you've just got to pick them and make sure that you have a home for them. So work out what you're trying to do with the seed afterwards. The act of growing it is great fun, but the better part is making sure you've got somewhere to put it. So work out what you want to do with it before you start collecting it.
So think about what we want to see growing in the future in our communities as well. Brill. So we are heading out and we're going to gather some seed. What different types of seed will we come across, and how will we know what to look for? In terms of the types of seed, what will we see?
Well, as we've shown in all of the stuff we produced, there are basically 4 main groupings of seed types in the UK. There are cones, there are nuts, there are wing seeds, there are fleshy fruits, and they all take different types of collection and processing. And then there are an extra one which wasn't on our original charts, which are those that have seed pods. So there are really 5. But each different type of nut or cone or wing seed has different reasons for existence, different mechanisms of being dispersed. I mean, fleshy fruits, for example, are supposed to be eaten by something. That's their job. They get eaten, and then the seed, which is in the middle of the fleshy fruit, gets passed through the gut of the creature that ate it, and it strips off the flesh, which actually inhibits the growth of the seed. And the animal having I don't know how to put this, going for a poo in the woods somewhere will then ensure that that seed has got a little bit of nutrient and gets started. That's the important way it gets going. Whereas back to our conker, the conkers originally are supposed to be spread by water. The reason for the cases and their spines is not only to protect against being eaten by something, but it also drops into the water and disperses by rivers down the hills in where horse chestnuts are native. So each seed has different properties, and you need to understand those properties before you can start to collect and process them.
And in terms of identifying the seeds that we're gathering, the Tree Growers Guide is a good place.
It is, and that's available free online. People can download it, have a look at it, use it, and if you follow the link there, you can see the document. It is an updated version of the one we did 20 years ago, and it really is packed with useful stuff on ID and all sorts of things. So have a look, see if that's any use for you, and hopefully it'll help you to work out what your seeds are.
Fabulous. Okay, so we have headed out, we have gathered our seed, and now we need to know what we do next with it, John. So we're going to start to understand a little bit about how we process the seeds that we get to try to create trees for the future. So I'm going to take down the slide so that we can see, because I see you seem to have an array of seeds.
All sorts of things here on the table to show everybody, all collected from my garden or in the hedge just outside. Over years of planning this, I've planted just about everything I could want somewhere locally so that we've got something to show you. And where do you want to start?
Should we start with nuts, John? Yeah, make a start with that category.
So the thing about nuts, as I've said, is that they are designed to be eaten by something. And so the first problem you have with the nuts is making sure the squirrels haven't eaten them first. We've taken a sort of slight latitude with what is a nut, because people may not consider that an acorn is actually a nut, but it is a form of nut. And therefore what you've got is nuts come in a whole range of, they come in protective cases. So the seed is inside. They come in, horrifically spiny cases to protect the seed from those animals that will love to scoff this one. And so your first job is to collect enough of the seeds, break them out of those spiny cases. And this is a sweet chestnut. Obviously, inside the sweet chestnut, there will be the seed.
And John, if they're still firmly in those spiny cases and they haven't opened, can you open them? Will the seeds be ripe, or do they need to?
Split. You see with this one from the sweet chestnut. One's fully ripe. This one. The other two that I've just taken out weren't quite ripe. It doesn't necessarily matter as long as they've had enough chance to fully develop. So collecting them off the ground is usually the best, but by that stage the squirrels have had them. So it's always a bit of a balancing act. So you will end up with a handful of nuts eventually. The question then comes, what do you do? How do you know which ones to plant? And for those of you who have been around with us for a while, you'll know that there is one simple tried and tested method to find out whether your nuts work, which is to find yourself a bowl of water and drop them in. And what you can see is that some of them have, hopefully you can see. Can you see that, Katie?
Yeah, I can see some floating on the surface.
Have sunk. The ones that have floated to the surface are completely useless. They will not germinate. So in that batch, all three of the sweet chestnuts have floated. So they're no good. But the acorns and conkers have sunk, except that conker, which looks perfectly all right, but isn't. And that simple act of dropping it in a bowl of water will separate out the good from the bad. We did once buy a batch of, or somebody, it wasn't us, but somebody bought a batch of acorns from a seed nursery, dropped them in a bowl of water, and of the 1,000 they bought, 990 odd were floaters. You cannot tell until you just do something simple like that of whether they're any good or not. Once they've sunk, take them out, and these are good. These are definitely good to plant.
And John, we've got a couple of people just mentioning in the chat, Nikki in South East Kent and Alec, that they've seen very few acorns and beech nuts this year. Someone else has mentioned last year was a big year for oak,
Yep.
and so after a last year there might not be as many. Is this something you've seen and fluctuate over from year to year?
Couldn't find any acorns this year for the purposes of doing this, apart from a very, very few. Mast years are intriguing. We don't truly understand what's happening in mast years. There is a PhD going on masting at the moment. What seems to happen is that the trees have periodic bouts of mass production. The idea being, or the theoretical idea being, that if you produce millions of seeds, there is more chance that the animals won't eat them than if you don't. So therefore, there's a greater chance that one or two of them will get through. So what you do is you have years of massive plenty so that it gets to germinate, and then you have years where you save energy and wait for the next massive year. We used to think that mast years were about every 7 or 8 years. It seems to be at the moment they're almost every 2 years, and it might be that we were just wrong, that they weren't every 7 years, that they are every couple of years. Last year was a very good mast year. It's almost inevitable the year afterwards that there won't be anything, and that's what's happened this year. But the truth
this is a good thing.
It's still in scientific and being looked at.
Yeah, so from year to year, you might have different success rates and different kind of seeds available to you. So if it's something you're doing regularly, year on year, then you might have different results.
Yeah, absolutely. So I literally couldn't find any acorns this year. I did find something vaguely interesting, which people might find interesting. Where was it? One of the things about acorns is there are 2 species, as we know. There's English oak and sessile oak, and the way you tell them apart is the length of the stalk on the acorn. So sessile oaks means sessile has no stalk. So the acorns of a sessile oak sit attached to the twig. The acorns of an English oak, a peduncular oak, have little stalks. Couldn't find you one, everybody, to show you that this year because they're literally none about. But the leaves are opposite. So if the acorn's on a stalk, then the leaf has no stalk. And if the acorns sit attached to the leaf, sorry, to the stem, the leaf has a stalk, and that's how you tell they're opposite. They're opposite way around. What I found this morning was what's called a rose oak, and I brought a little bit to show you. It's just down from me. Hadn't really noticed it before. And a rose oak is the hybrid between the English oak and the sessile oak, and this has stalks on the leaves, and hopefully you can see that stalk on the leaf. And these would have been the acorns here. And hopefully you can see these. And you can see that these are stalked as well. There's a stalk on there. There's a stalk on here, which makes this what's called a rose oak, which is the hybrid between the 2 native species. And the other way to spot it is that they have really leathery, thick leaves, much thicker than this is I picked an English oak leaf, a sort of ordinary oak leaf, much thicker than this one. You can see the light shining through this one, hopefully. This is much darker, much more leathery. Just one of the things that you can, bit of tree ID that you can learn by looking at the length of the acorn stalks.
And we talked about seed ID, but using the leaves, using the flowers that occur at different times of year is a good way to ID the tree that we then gather seeds from.
Yeah.
Fab. So shall we move on to the fruits, the fleshy fruits?
Fleshy fruits. Now, fleshy fruits are the most varied of all of the seed types. There are all sorts of different things, from rowan berries through apples, plums, cherries. Obviously, depends on the time of year you're at. There was a plum somewhere here. I've lost him. You get red ones, you get white ones. This is a white berry off a white species of rowan. You get berries that come in pink shells. This is spindle with orange berries inside. There's a whole range of types and colors and shapes. You get black ones. And the whole purpose of these is to be eaten. they want to be eaten. So they are colours that will attract some certain something. Birds love red. So lots of berries are red. Birds love eating red things. So lots of stuff is red. This is, of course, yew. Technically a cone, but has a fleshy fruit around it. For those of you that know anything about your trees, yews are, every bit of a yew is poisonous. Never a good idea. The only bit of a yew that isn't poisonous is the red flesh, because the birds love it. So they eat this. The trouble is that the seed, which is contained in the middle, which is actually a little cone, that bit is lethally poisonous to humans. So if you want to eat a yew berry, you can. I wouldn't advise it randomly, but you can, but only the red bit, never the black bit. It's one of those sort of, they taste a bit sweet. They're not particularly pleasant, but they are edible to humans, but not with the black bit in the middle.
Definitely sounds safer to avoid that to me.
The point is, though, that it's eaten by something, and being eaten by something then strips off the fruit. And while the fruit is there, the seed is inhibited from developing. You have to remove the flesh. That happens by passing through the gut of a bird. And then what you're left with is the little tiny seed in the middle. This is the one, oh, I don't know if I can. Yeah, the one little seed in the middle, that is the rowan seed. Now, obviously, if you're trying to strip the seed off a berry, to try and do that properly, it's quite a slow process. So we go back to our trusty bowl of water. Our trusty bowl of water is really useful. We chuck in our berries, and then we raid the kitchen, and you find yourself a potato masher. And with a potato masher, you literally mash the seed. And in mashing the seed seed will separate from the flesh. And with a bit of care, you can then pick it all out. It's a slower process than anything else, but it is necessary to get rid of that flesh. Otherwise, it won't develop. And obviously, if you've got... Go on, sorry.
I was just going to say, we've got a question from Pauline saying, with fleshy fruit plants, is it better to propagate via cuttings rather than seeds?
No, it is easy to do by seed. It's just a bit slower. I mean, it depends what you're after. So that gets us into some complicated stuff. So obviously, one of our fruits, which is fleshy, is apples. How are apples, what is designed to eat apples? Well, if it's crab apples, it's actually cows and ponies. And crab apple almost only germinates if it comes out of a cow, with a bit of extra nutrients at the back, or a pony. But obviously, if you cut an apple in half, there are seeds in it. Now, here's where it gets a bit complicated, because apples have really, really complicated breeding systems. So there's your apple seed, which is a little tiny thing. And this is an apple tree from my garden over there. This is called Newton's Wonder. It will have, within this apple, it will have 12 different seeds. Each one of those seeds will be genetically unique. And if you want to get that to grow into an apple tree, you can, and you'll produce a wholly new variety of apple. It will not be what the parent was, because it's had something else mixed into it. So it's a wholly new apple. And there will be 12 unique apples inside, or 12 unique trees inside this one apple, which is why it's worth growing from seed. It's really good with kids. You can literally get them to create their own apple tree. It's not until it fruits that you will realize whether the apples are any good. But the Bramley was started by a little girl called Mary Ann Brailsford. She grew them in her garden. She grew an apple from seed, turned out to be the nicest in the village. She then gave them away to people in the village. Everybody ate them because they were so nice. And she called it, because it's a seedling, a pippin then, so it was just her pippin tree. Then along came a man called Mr. Bramley. He bought a bit of the apple tree, commercially produced it, because with fruit, if you want it to be breeding true, particularly apples, you have to take cuttings, which takes us back to the question. And every Bramley apple you've ever eaten in your life comes from that one tree in a Nottinghamshire garden created by a little girl called Mary Ann Brailsford, who planted a seed. So in here,
and that answers the question that's come in. How do you then continue on that variety if it changes every time, but you do it through cuttings?
Cuttings, yeah. So if you want your fruit to breed true of the commercial varieties, you almost always have to take a cutting. But if you're not worried about it because it's a rowan and you don't care, it's just a rowan, then you do it from seed.
And John, if I have an apple tree that is kind of been there for a while, I haven't planted it, I haven't sown it, how do I know what variety of apples are on that tree? Is there a way that I can ID them? Do I just see if they taste nice and go with it? What can I do?
If it's nice and go with it. There's about 4,500 different English apples on the books. Many of those are repeats. They've different apple in different places with different names. Certainly over 2,500 different, specifically different types of fruit. There are some truly great experts who can tell them by the shape of, and the way you do it is with three features. You do it by the length of the stalk, by the shape of the eye, by the color, and by the patternation of the seeds as you've cut the apple in half. But there's probably only about a couple of dozen people in the country who can really do that really well. There are new tests that are being developed to try and DNA them so that we could actually have quick and easy DNA tests. I'm not sure whether they're commercially available yet, but it's certainly being worked on. So for the moment, find an expert or just enjoy it and propagate it if you think it's worth propagating.
Fab. And the last question before we move on to the next category, have you come across blackberried hawthorn? So there have been some plants on South Dartmoor hedgerow recently that appear to have be hawthorn with blackberries.
No. Would genuinely be interested to hear about that. If somebody can send me some pictures, if somebody can send me a, are they ripe fruit? Are they? I mean, obviously there are different species of hawthorn. This is an introduced one, so there are different species of hawthorn, and so obviously you get different shapes of berries. There are, I mean, acorns go black when they've not been fertilized, but I've never heard of it on hawthorn. So if
So we might follow that up separately.
not might, whoever that was, we need to know. Send us some
Not
pictures.
mine. John's interest is piqued. He wants to know more. Fab. Okay.
To know more. That's fascinating. Yes, please. More.
More of that. Let's move on to winged seeds now, John.
Okay. Wing seeds are the simplest of the bunch to do anything with because these are basically what when I was a kid we used to call helicopters. They produce little wings. I need to get it where you can see it. They produce little wings. This is the wing that helps with the dispersal of the helicopter part of the flight. The seed is actually down here. This is the seed at the base. And the truth of those is that once you've collected them, they really only need to be pushed into the ground just to the point where half the leaf blade is showing, because that's what happens in nature, and they will germinate from that point. So it's the simplest of all of the seeds to do something with. You literally just pop them in the soil, push it down.
And is that just standard soil, John?
This is just standard soil. There's something slightly different about with stratification, which we could come back to.
Yeah.
You can do that in stratified medium or just soil. For the moment, this is just soil.
And can I ask, I see green winged seeds on the ground as well as some that you can see like yours there that are brown and are kind of dried out. Is there a preference as to which I collect? Do they work either way?
So what happens is that there is considerable difference in the amount of time it takes to germinate. So if you take ash, for example, you get green ash and then it ripens to brown. While it's green, it will germinate in the next year. When it is brown, it will take 18 months to 2 years to germinate. So it's part of the process that the seeds fall off, and some will come up that year and the next year, and some will a year after. So if you're wanting speed, then you try to get them when they're green. if you're not worried about it because you're on a long-term schedule, just it doesn't matter. But it might take 2 years for it to develop.
Okay, fab. And shall we move on to corns?
Yeah, I hope everybody. I'm madly throwing out information, so I apologise if it's too fast. But there's so much that you want to say, and not enough time to talk about it.
There's all sorts of interesting conversation in the chat as well, John. I think you'll be fascinated to read it at the end.
I can't see any of that.
But yeah, I think we're covering off the questions that are coming through.
This was one that I wanted to point out well before we did seeds. Some of them have some interesting properties, and you should always be a touch careful when you're looking at berries and collecting berries. This one, I don't know if anybody knows what. I'll give you 10 seconds to see if anybody can identify this one.
This is the quiz section of the webinar, guys.
Of the webinar. Tell me if anybody can. Will, tell me if anybody does. And I'm just going to eat a bit of apple because I'm hungry while we're waiting. Anybody know what that is?
We have alder buckthorn. Alder.
Anthony Mills got it right. It's purging buckthorn, common buckthorn, purging buckthorn. The thing you've got to be a bit careful about this one.
I love that you took it into your apple at the same time, John. I couldn't resist because it was sat there in front of you.
Couldn't eat the apple at that moment. The thing about purging buckthorn is it does what it says on the tin. Its Latin name is cathartica. It has a really interesting effect on one's metabolism. Definitely not one to eat unless you want to be confined to home for 24 hours.
Stick to the apples today, John. Then.
Stick to the apples. Don't try eating those because that will really not do you any good at all. Yeah, I used to use it for medicine to get rid of all sorts of stuff out of people. Where were we? Wing seeds.
We were moving on to corns, I think.
Cones. Cones are complex. Cones take a long time to develop. And cones come on a variety of species. So cones can take many years to develop. So they start almost universally as green cones. And then as they ripen, they become brown. And as they get a bit further, they get lighter brown and they start to open. And you can see this one's just starting to open. You will never get a seed out of that because you won't. It's physically impossible. When they're green, they're locked tight. It's part of their defense mechanism. It's about protecting what's going on inside. As they start to ripen and go brown, you can see that the scales start to open. And then it's possible to get the seeds out, but you have to break it apart. When they're getting to this stage, you can start to tease the seeds out. But it's not easy. And so the best and simplest thing to do with this is to be patient. Find a paper bag, put them in, bring them into the house. If you're old-fashioned and have a fire, put them somewhere near the fire so they get warm. Put them on a sunny windowsill. They will gently, over time, turn brown, ripen, and the seeds will then naturally fall out and they'll fall into the bag. Shake the bag when they start to ripen. And it will work. And that's how you get your seeds out. All of this for everybody is in the Good Seed Guide. There is one exception to this rule, which is this. This is noble firs, and noble firs produce these beautiful cones. This is a one-time only exercise, though, and I've been waiting to do this for the last couple of days to show everybody this, and hoped that it wouldn't happen before we got to today. Because what happens with these is as the cone ripens, the seeds become looser. And suddenly what happens is they start to fall out. And what happens with this type of cone is that the whole thing deconstructs in front of your eyes. Look at this. How wonderful is that? There are hundreds.
So each little fragment of that cone is a seed.
Fragment of it is a seed. Yep. Every one of those is a seed coming out individually. That's a seed that will grow a tree that will produce a 100-foot tree. And look at this. Look, it just isn't that wonderful? I'm sorry. I just really love it. Look at that, and it falls apart in front of you, and suddenly you're just left with a central spindle up the middle, where all of the seeds have fallen off, and now you have. I've never counted them, but must be upwards of 1,000 seeds off one cone. Just beautiful. How clever is nature? Look at that. Isn't that amazing?
That is certainly impressive. I feel like you need to count them as well before with next seed gathering season, John, just so we know.
I probably should, but there are literally thousands, well, not thousands maybe, but hundreds. I know, as I say, never counted them, but.
And we've just been asked again, can you repeat what is the name of the tree that corn comes from? And is it found across the UK in certain areas?
So this is one that's really quite uncommon. It's mostly planted in places like Scotland, in a few places in Scotland. It's found in gardens. So there's two that do this. There's noble fir and grand fir. They both look very similar. You get them in gardens. You get them in. But if you find one, just the joy of just all of those seeds as a possibility of doing something with, well, what more do you want out of life? Sad as I am.
We've just got a quick question from Anthony Melville. Does a lime count as a winged seed, John?
Yes. So I forgot to do limes, and here is a lime. So wing seeds, so there's the wing. It's not really, because it isn't. This is really, it falls into the nut category because these are little nuts fundamentally, but they have a wing that helps them to disperse. So again, it's designed to fly. Oh, that actually worked. You get the idea. They're designed to fly. This is obviously the bit you need. You treat it like an acorn and you just bury it in the soil. And we haven't talked about stratification yet.
That is the perfect time to start on that bit. We have had a question, do we know what to do when we do the seed? So this is the stratification process.
So when you've got all these lovely seeds, what do you do with them? The first thing you've got to do is get them through the winter to get them to the point of germinating for next spring. So the way to do that is to get yourself some pots, or you can put them in the fridge. Some people put them in the fridge, store them in the fridge, and then sow them in the spring. That works. But me, I'm old-fashioned. My wife doesn't like me filling up the freezer with all sorts of seeds, so she's not greatly keen. They do need a period of chilling. They do need to get cold for the winter. So you need to find an outdoor space. But what you then need to get is a pot or pots or a bucket or depends on the scale of your exercise. And you need two things. You need some compost, which is here, or if you've got nice soil, some nice soil. And you need some of this sand, or fine grit. Doesn't really matter which, even a mixture of all three, but you basically want about 50-50 mix. So they're about the same.
And is that just general purpose peat-free compost, John?
Yeah, peat-free compost. Yeah. And what you want to do is mix them together to produce a sort of a mixture that looks a bit like this. It's sand and compost. Oops. Put it into your pot. For those of you old enough to remember Blue Peter, it definitely feels like Blue Peter this afternoon. You're mixing up your sand and your soil to produce this sort of mixture, and into that you then place your seeds. Again, we've set it all out in detail in the Good Seed Guide, the Tree Growers Guide. But basically you want to just put your seed into the pots and stratify it in layers. Put them in.
And is builder's sand okay to use? We've just got the question there.
Yeah, equal proportion sand, soil and seeds is the perfect mix. And what you're after then is something that you can just leave them to. It's not designed to grow in there. It's just designed to stay there safely for the winter. You need to cover them with a bit of a brick or a bit of wire so that the animals don't get in and eat them all out. And this is just the storage mechanism to keep them through the winter. As I say, the other way of doing it is to stick them in the freezer. And
if you're putting them in the fridge, John, do you do the same thing? Do you mix soil and
not necessarily. not necessarily. It depends. Again, depends on the species. Look in the guide. Too many variations to explain.
And what's the benefit of adding the sand? Why not just use compost?
Free draining. It helps it not hold water. If the water's there, then they will get to a place where they rot. So you need something that adds the ability for the water to drain through. So your pots or whatever need to have a hole in the bottom so that they drain. The worst thing is they sit in water all winter, then they will just die. So you need something, or rot. So you need something that's free draining, that can store the seeds. And then in the spring, what you do is you tip out this mixture, and you'll start to see that some of them start to germinate. The germinating ones you then pot on into a pot to get them started.
And is this the same with, obviously we've talked about nuts, acorns, etc. Is this the same with something like birch, which is obviously a much smaller seed? Do you mix that all in? So is that deep, or do you just sprinkle it over the surface and cover it lightly?
For the purposes of this, it doesn't matter because it's a storage thing. All right. But if you are, when you come to sowing them next spring, then it matters. So when you're sowing them in the spring, you've got to work out how you're planting those young seeds in the winter, in the spring. And the sort of basic rule of thumb is that you should plant the seeds about twice as deep into the soil as they are thick. So, for example, if you think of that as let's say that's a centimetre deep, when you're sowing them, you would put it about 2 centimetres into the soil so that it just has a little bit of depth. Whereas if you're sowing birch seeds, it's almost like cress. You sow them on the surface of the soil because they're so tiny. And there are somewhere here, there's some birch seeds. You know what birch seeds look like, little tiny grains of dust. Sow them on the surface and then cover them lightly in soil, because in that process you get give them the best chance of germinating. I think Anthony's asked if they go in the fridge or the freezer and for how long. It depends, Anthony, on your on the species. Some can go in for sort of 10 to 12 weeks, 3 or 4 months. And you can put them in the freezer if your freezer is not set to, extreme cold. Freezer or fridge can do both. It's just got to have a period of chilling. And again, it depends how cold your fridge is. I don't usually use the freezer, so I'm not as familiar with the methods that some people use. But again, that's why we've set it all out in the book. I usually
Is that almost pretending to be winter, John?
Pretending to be winter, because they need a period of cold. Seed needs to know when to germinate. So if it's falling now, does it start germinating now? And if it does, what's the chances that seedling going to make it? So what happens is the seed waits for a trigger. The trigger is it's got cold. Then the cold stops, and therefore the seed thinks, oh, it's spring, and it starts to germinate. So it's the cold that sets the process in motion that says it's now spring, you can start to develop. And it's the same with these. Store them somewhere cold, north-facing wall, dark spot, somewhere where they get cold for the winter. What was that comment? Stratification in the fridge? I can't see that one, Simon.
Can sometimes be better than the outdoors because our weather isn't necessarily consistent. We don't know whether we're going to get a cold winter or a cold enough spell. And
that's one of the problems as we're getting more and more climate change. There's obviously less and less cold periods. So in there lies something that isn't really having a massive material effect just yet that we know of, but might over time. So fridges and freezers are really useful as a way of fooling the things into thinking it's winter.
And just to clarify, someone asked, so the soil and sand mix is for stratification over winter, and then when we sow them out, that can just be into soil.
Into soil or into compost. Depends whether you're going to sow them into pots or into a seed bed. If you're sowing them into a seed bed, you might actually want to grow them in the ground. Then obviously you prepare your ground of your seed bed properly with some decent soil, and then you scatter your seeds onto the surface of that. If you want to grow them in pots or some people grow them in big old sort of can't think of the word, but like oil drums cut in half with soil in it so that they've got them started. There are lots of different methods of doing it. I like having them in pots, because if they're in pots, then you've got control over how you deal with them afterwards. You've got them growing, you've got them containable, you've got them manageable. You can even do some really bizarre things. This is my little bonsai olive tree that I grew from seed of an olive that I ate. And I've just kept the seed and grown a little bonsai tree. And I'm keeping this one in a pot to see if I can grow olives on a bonsai just for the heck of it, really. So you can do all sorts of things. But again, it's slightly different for each species. It's difficult to, we sort of need another session where we do a one on what happened when,
specific species. And we've got a question from Karen. If she gathered seeds last year or in previous years, can you use them now? Can you stratify them now, or does it have to be this year's seed?
That's a really interesting question, and it depends. It depends, Karen, on the species. As I said, ash, for example, will last 2 years. So if it was seed from last year's and it was ash, then it would. But an acorn, and it's one of the really peculiar things about nature, is that we've not worked out how to store acorns for more than one season. They dry out. In fact, they dry out in a couple of weeks to months. So you could not have acorns that would last for 2 years. You could have ash seed. So again, it's species dependent.
And John, if I have stratified seed, I have sown it in spring. If nothing has come up, if kind of I've had some success and some that hasn't, do I get rid of everything? If nothing's germinated after stratification, is that, do I kind of get rid of it and start again by collecting again in autumn? Is any of it likely to still come up in future years?
It depends on the species. And it depends how early you look. If you start looking in February, there's be nothing happening. If you wait until April, some of it might have germinated.
So a bit of patience.
So a bit of patience is required. Let it go. Let it see what happens. It's all a bit experimental, but that's the joy of it.
Fabulous. Well, I think compared to last year, John, I think we've kept to time fairly well this year. So we might have rattled through some bits, but we haven't run over, so that's a positive.
I have
if
no
anyone's
idea.
got any final questions, please do stick them in the Q&A. Anything kind of specific or any general questions before you start your seed gathering. As we've mentioned, please do check out the Tree Growers Guide, so you can download that for free online. I believe we'll share the link in the chat. You can, if you want a hard copy, there is a link on our website to buy a copy if you'd like a hard copy in front of you. Another question come in there, John. Does potting on need to happen at a specific time of year?
Yes. Basically, Carol, you need to be doing that in the spring. Specifically, you need to do it when they start to germinate. So it will depend on the species, but mid-March to mid-April is when most of the stuff starts to appear. Potted on then.
I imagine that'll be affected by where we are in the UK as well.
Yeah, and is very much species dependent. So hard to be specific, but as a broad principle, spring, March to April, that's roughly when it will happen.
And do we need to keep seeds moist when we're stratifying over winter? Do we need to water them? Anything like that?
No. That's the last thing you want to do, because if you add too much water, they will rot. So just let nature take its case. Make sure it drains freely. A little bit. I mean, if you have no rain at all for the entire winter and you've put it under then there is a risk that they will completely dry out. So occasional bits of water, but certainly not regularly watering it like a tree. Just a bit every now and again.
And one more, can you stratify different seeds together? So could I mix all different seeds in the same medium, same sand and compost mix?
You absolutely could. It, of course, makes it a bit harder if you're breaking it up in the spring. So it does make sense to have a cone pot and a rowan pot because then you're looking at only one thing at one time. So it's logical to do it in separate pots. But it's completely possible to do them all in one place in one time.
Fabulous. Now, I am aware that it is just hit 2 o'clock, and many of you will have to leave to get onto other things. Thank you so much for joining us this seed gathering season. We will have a recording of the session.
Label the pots, because otherwise you'll forget.
Key information from John. He needs to finish the advice before we finish the webinar. But this recording will be available on our website, and you can check out those other webinar recordings from previous seed gathering season events that we've had in the past few weeks as well. So thank you so much for getting involved, for all of your fantastic questions, for putting John to the test. And we really hope that's been helpful and informative. And we hope you have a great seed gathering season and have a productive haul and grow some fantastic trees for the future.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.